underneath this rather idyllic scene of trees and fields lies one of the most busiest motorways in this country, the M6. It provides us with an interesting backdrop to this episode as we look at Psalm 26, largely because underneath the serenity of David's integrity and his love and his peace and all the stuff that he assumes is just puts him in a good place, free from relative pressure, doesn't seem to do the trick, because alongside that, the trees and the hills and the serenity, he's got the noisy busyness and danger of an M6. He's got the pressures, the difficulties in life that stand in contradiction to what he assumes he should be experiencing because of his integrity. Like a lot of us, when we do the right thing, we expect an easier time. And when we do the wrong thing, pressure. David is doing the right thing and getting pressure. And that's the conflict of Psalm 26. David begins this psalm with the words, "Vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity. I have trusted in the Lord without wavering." Begs the question, why do good people suffer? Why does difficulty come to those who are convinced that they are living the best they possibly can? There's a massive contrast between this psalm and the previous one. In Psalm 25, David seems obsessed with his own sense of guilt and shame. In this psalm, it's more his integrity and his trust. And you'd almost think, is David being deluded here? Is he talking like he's a man who's got it together, when in reality, particularly according to the last psalm, he obviously hasn't? No, I think they're different viewpoints. David is operating on a different perspective in this particular chapter. He's looking at why pressure comes, even to those of us who live right, and trying to grapple with an understanding of that. Sometimes, if you like, even a fairness to it, if a fairness can be applied at all. Of these two psalms are very different. In Psalm 25, David is appreciating that all his troubles are coming from the fact that he himself had done things wrong. He was a sinner. In fact, he framed his guilt with the word great. Such was the intensity that he felt. But in Psalm 26, it's very different, because here David feels as if he's possibly being pursued and the punishment has come upon him, even though he's living right. And I think that's the hardest part of tough times. A lot of us can identify with David in Psalm 25. Stuff happens because I haven't got it right. I'm making mistakes. I'm inviting the pressure of life on myself. But in Psalm 26, that's much more a perplexing place to be, because we assume that if we do get it right and we are living to the best of our ability and making wiser choices, why should we still have the pressure? It's probably written at a time when David is being pursued by Saul and feeling the pressure of that. And of course, he looks into himself and thinks, I'm living with integrity, I'm living the best I can, and yet I'm still experiencing severe tough times. Why is that? That's the crux, that's the context, that's the struggle of this particular psalm. Appreciating that context of this psalm, David's opening words become more understandable. Vindicate me, O Lord, for I have walked in my integrity. I have trusted in the Lord without wavering. I have walked, I have trusted. And in the next 4 verses, David goes on to cement the fact that, as far as he can see, he's been living right. In fact, he's so convinced that he's in the right place that in the next verse, he even invites God to do the unthinkable, to prove and examine him. Well, you've got to be pretty confident, I think, to to really invite God to take a deeper look at your life, because guilty people seldom invite scrutiny, don't they? Guilty people would be frightened to death that God would take a closer look at them, and yet David here is inviting God to do just that. He's so assured of his conduct and his behavior. And this it's almost like when you look at the last psalm and look at this, there's this incongruity. David confesses to a waywardness within himself, but outside he's talking about his obedience. And Psalm 25, he confesses almost to a deceitfulness within himself. And yet here he's proclaiming his integrity. We all live with that dualistic sense of nature. It's like a complex sense and flux. And this is what David is talking about here. When you take these two psalms together, you get this complex state of flux that is true of every one of us. We are all a mixture of imperfection, striving for perfection. We're all in a place of, if you like, carnality, reaching forth for purity. We are people who are well accustomed to deceiving ourselves, longing to be truthful and honest. We are in this battle, and David isn't settled in his waywardness. He's fighting to get away from it. Hypocrites are those who embrace their deceitfulness whilst trying to be truthful. But it's their attitude of what they embrace that defines them as a hypocrite. David did not embrace his carnality. It repulsed him. He battled with it daily. His wish, if there was such a wish he could make, would have been to be rid of it. Such was the desire he had for purity and honesty. Every single one of us are kind of battling in this. Nobody struck a deal with their inner hypocrite. They've not said it's okay to be this double standard life. David wasn't happy with that. And the moment we get happy living in dishonest ways, living in deception, living in carnality, the moment that becomes an okay thing to do is the moment we've lost our true integrity and that true sense of what it means to be a child of God. Every one of us battles with stuff, but the battle is because we despise it and want to get out of it. The battle is not to keep it. And David, in the same way, is battling to get out of it. He lives honorably, but he's battling with dishonest tendencies. Like me and you, he lives trustworthy, but he's battling deceptive tendencies. Living obediently, but battling disobedience. We can all relate to that at one level or another. David's desire to live honorably is borne out when you come to the 6th, the 7th, and the 8th verses. Listen to what he says. I wash my hands in innocence. I go around your altar, O Lord, proclaiming thanksgiving aloud and telling all your wondrous deeds. O Lord, I love the habitation of your house and the place where your glory dwells. David, his efforts are focused on doing the right thing. In verse 6, he wants to do the right thing in behavior. In verse 7, he wants to do the right thing in speech. And in verse 8, he wants to do the right thing in what he attaches himself and associates himself with. David is watching his life. He is passionate to live the right life. In those three raw components of actions and speech and associations, David is wanting to live a godly life. It's the battle to get there that is defining him and what he is kind of opening up to in the 26th and the 25th Psalm. These are the two Psalms that outline it. It is not who we are now in the present that ultimately is the big decider. It's where we're heading. It's not that I struggle now. It's whether or not I'm happy to retain that struggle and live in that mess. It's not the state I'm in now, whether I'm living out of sync with God. It's the fact of whether or not I've accommodated that out of syncness and I'm becoming happy with it. It's becoming a routine in my life. The challenge is where I'm heading, how I'm trying to move away from that to get to something bigger and better. These kinds of journeys are depicted many times in Scripture. You look at a king, Saul. Saul is on the outward a king of idealism, he's a king of godliness, he's a king of principle, but inside, as you read through Samuel, becomes very apparent, He's eaten up with jealousy and rivalry and insecurity. But then on the flip side, you look at a David, and when David is shepherding his sheep, he's just a rugged shepherd boy with not much about him and no promise at all that one day he could become Israel's greatest king. But inside David is a strong, giant-like devotion, a deep commitment to living a godly life. So sometimes we can appear one way and be another, and yet we can belie the fact that underneath that, something very different is going on. We're catching David in this psalm in the middle of what is an incredible struggle for him, an intensity for him. And it's what we all face in life, that dualistic trouble of one side wanting to live, the other side struggling to do it. One side desperately wanting to be godly and the other struggling in our carnality. And David is depicting that struggle. He knows he's a man of integrity and wonders why that integrity brings such pressure on him. And I think each of us would be able to identify with that. Times in our lives when we just see there's no justifiable reason why we are seen to be going through such dark and difficult times. And we catch David in the spirit of that as we think about it in our own lives also. When you get to verse 9, it's quite a heart-rendering and touching appeal of David's, because he says, "Do not sweep my soul away with sinners." And in verse 10, "In whose hands are evil desires, whose right hands are full of bribes." David's almost saying, God, take notice of my integrity. Don't just think I'm like every other ungodly person who's got no interest in you. Please take a look at my life. Notice that I am living for you. Notice my obedience. Notice that I'm not kind of dismissing the importance of it. And I don't think any of us fully appreciates perhaps the tension David felt, but we can all identify with the fact that there are times we feel like, what is the point of living a godly life? Does God really recognize it? Because it seems the godlier I live, the more pressure I get put under. The godlier I live, the more tension I'm living with. What's the point of being godly? That's some of David's disheartening logic as he looks at his own life and absorbs this intensity of pressure at this period of time in his life that seems to be coming for no apparent reason. But what is incredibly powerful about this psalm is when you get to verse 11, because there's a huge, huge three-letter word, B-U-T. David, despite the fact that he's got this pressure in his life, despite the fact that he feels it's unjustified in places, despite the fact he's seeking to live godly and yet absorbing such pressure, he says this, "But as for me," he makes a concrete decision that he's not going to cave into the pressures. He's not going to allow them to dictate the standard and health of his faith. David is saying, just because I'm undergoing pressure that I can't understand, it does not mean I'm going to abandon God and I'm going to dump it all because I think God should be behaving this way and he's deciding to behave that way. David is making an appeal. It's like the pinnacle of godliness, I think, that when our lives are compressed and the pressure is on, we still make a decision to live for God. However we're treated, however we are perceived by others, however we are misrepresented, nevertheless, David says, I'm going to live, I'm going to do the right thing. However much it may cost me, my choice will be for obedience. It's a staggering statement, but as for me, David says, it's reminiscent of Joshua. Do you remember in Joshua 24:15 when Israel was going by the rails and Joshua said, choose this day who you will serve. And then he comes out with this wonderful statement, as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. It's those critical decisions in moments of our lives, particularly intense pressure, that define us and define our faith. Again, Paul in Philippians 3, sitting in Rome under house arrest, under impending execution, could say this, "But one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward." You know the scripture in Philippians 3:13. Paul is saying, despite the fact that I'm continually under pressure, continually bombarded, almost judged for doing the right thing. Nevertheless, he said, there is one thing I persistently do. I move forward. I go for the big goal. I think it's a fantastic lesson, a great challenge for all of us, that in lots of ways, when we are at our most difficult in life, it is so easy just to collapse, to compromise, to bend the rules a little. And yet it seems that men like David and Joshua and Paul and others seem to get more defined in their faith, stronger and more committed, doubly determined, in spite of the fact that everything around them would say, let it go, draw a compromise. That is a hallmark of a truly godly life. One of the great comforts in David's life is found in that 11th verse, in this little line, redeem me and be gracious to me. It's almost as if David says, if I make a decision to do what's right, I can trust God to look after me in every other way, ultimately for my protection and deliverance and rescue. God will be there, in spite of the fact that the current situation, the present circumstances may dictate otherwise, may tell me that it's actually all going south and I'm really struggling. Needless to say, David is resilient. He's almost arrogant. He knows that if he sticks with God, but as for me, if he lives the godly life, all these other things eventually will fall into place. They may not immediately, but ultimately they will. He's almost saying, bring the worst of what you've got, life, circumstances, whatever, because I know that God will still be on my side. He will bring me through to that place of redemption. For personally, his integrity will bear him witness. His holiness will clear his name. He knows that because such is God. His steadfast love and his faithfulness will remain with him and protect him, in spite of the fact that at present, right now, as he's writing this psalm, he's in a really tough and difficult place. It reminds me of those powerful words found in the book of Habakkuk. In the 3rd chapter, the 17th and 18th verse, we read this: though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, and produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. You can almost hear Habakkuk carrying this very similar resilience that David displays in this latter half of this 26th Psalm. Even if everything goes wrong, I will still obey. I will still trust. I will still rejoice. Though he slay me, Job could say, yet will I trust him. There is this absolute dogged determination to know that God will see me through this, that he will pull me out of this, in spite of the fact that everything around me is telling me this is a disaster. Some of us, as we have kind of come even to this episode, you may be in a place thinking, I couldn't explain to you how difficult my life's been. The reality is, God is good, and God is love, and God is just. Those are fundamental truths of the nature of God, which means nothing bad will ultimately happen. Nothing ugly, nothing unjust. For God is a God who will put things right. And our role, even when we can't understand the situation, is just to trust. And as we trust, there is a process, a production, a kind of a progression that's happening in our lives that God uses to enhance and build us and structure us. Much of the trouble we face has been customized to our lives to enable us to move up the levels of godliness that we need to move up, to strengthen relevant areas of our character. Sometimes God allows the pressure because it's the only device through which he can strengthen us and gird us. And let me encourage you, like David, you might be thinking, vindicate me, God. I'm a person of integrity and yet I'm experiencing this. But the reality is, because you're a person of integrity, God is sending that trouble to enhance you, to build you, to develop you, to strengthen you, to turn you into a far more formidable force of character than you presently are. And in that sense, we welcome the problems only because we know that through them, God is almost doing us a favor. He's building us into a different person. God bless you.